In today's video, I want to address a long-standing request, and that is how to set up Dolby Atmos in Pro Tools. I've made several videos in the past demonstrating Dolby Atmos production workflows in various digital audio workstations, and I'll leave a link to a playlist below. But I've never covered this process in Pro Tools. Now, when working with Dolby Atmos in Pro Tools, you really have two options. You can either use the internal Dolby Atmos renderer that comes with Pro Tools, or you can use the external Dolby Atmos renderer, which offers additional features that are primarily for professional users. Both workflows are straightforward, but I've decided to create two separate videos, one for each renderer. This is mainly because there are important differences between the two workflows and I didn't want to cause any confusion. So in today's video, the first part of this two-part series will use the internal Dolby Atmos renderer in Pro Tools. Now, one advantage of doing it that way is that this also works in Windows, so you are not limited to Mac OS. Pro Tools handles some things differently from other digital audio workstations, so even if you're not a Pro Tools user, you should find this video interesting. So without further ado, let's roll the intro. Before I start, let me quickly remind you what Dolby Atmos is, as not everyone watching this video might be familiar with the details. Simply put, Dolby Atmos is a next-generation audio technology that aims to create a more immersive audio experience. Traditional surround sound systems typically use speakers placed around the listener on a single level. Dolby Atmos takes this further by adding a height dimension to the audio. It achieves this by treating sounds as individual objects that can be precisely placed and moved in three-dimensional space, and this allows for a more accurate and lifelike sound positioning, making you feel more like you are inside the action. In addition to these objects, Dolby Atmos also contains a base layer called the Dolby Atmos bed, which is typically in 7.1.2 format. This layer serves as a foundation on which the 3D experience is built. When Dolby Atmos is produced well, the result is a richer, more enveloping sound experience. Now let's jump into Pro Tools and see how Dolby Atmos is produced using the internal tools provided directly by Pro Tools. So I'm going to work with Pro Tools Ultimate today, but most of the things that I'm going to show work with the studio version as well. And the way I'm going to do that today is that I'm going to start out with a completely empty stereo session because I want to demonstrate on how to set everything up manually. You would have the option to simply start with a template. That's perfectly fine. But once again, in this video, I just want to show how to actually turn everything into Dolby Atmos if you're starting out in stereo. So what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to create a new session and let's call that test. And what I'm going to do is in the input-output settings, I'm simply going to use a stereo setup. And with that, let's create our session. I'm going to save that to the desktop. And what I have here is I have two loops essentially that I took from a sample developer that I actually like quite a lot. I'm going to leave a link in the description and I'm going to simply create a session that consists of those two loops. And then we're going to take these loops and we're going to position them in three-dimensional space, essentially with Dolby Atmos. So here I have my empty session in Pro Tools. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my two loops and I'm going to drop that into my session. So here I have a drum loop and then I have a plug loop, and then let's have a listen what we have here. So once again, the drum loop and the plug loop. And that's really all we need because we just want to demonstrate how Dolby Atmos works. And for that, I'm going to send the drums into the Dolby Atmos bed and I'm going to use the plugs as one object, because once you know how to do one object, you know how to do many objects. That is relatively straightforward. So we are going to work with the internal Dolby Atmos renderer. A couple of things we need to make sure that we have. First of all, make sure that you see the object category here. If you don't see that, right click here and make sure that this is selected because we are going to work with objects. And then we need to kind of complete the input-output setup. So we are going to go into the setup settings under input-output. And here we see this additional tab here, Dolby Atmos, and that is where we essentially select what type of render we're going to use. Now we're going to work with the internal renderer. So here you have the selection between internal and external renderer. Now I'm going to use the internal renderer. I'm going to select here, and this will automatically kind of populate all the objects and all the bed channels and everything. Now, if you don't see that, you can always click here on default, and that will essentially kind of set that back to default. And that's really everything that we need to do here. So let's kind of move our two tracks into object/bed channels. And this is really straightforward to do because we already set up everything. So what we need to do is we need to kind of, first of all, take the drums, and we're going to move that into the bed. So we're going to select here the bed channels. And then for the plugs, we're going to move that into an object. And for that, we're going to select output as no output. And then we're going to select here objects, and we can select whatever objects we want. I'm going to use the first two objects. And then I also need to kind of click here in order to kind of make that an object. And that now should move everything into Dolby Atmos. So if I play that now, I should hear exactly the same thing. The only difference now is that it is sent into the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's play it again. Now, if I want to see how that looks in the Dolby Atmos renderer, I need to bring up the Dolby Atmos renderer by kind of going into the window, and I see essentially here that I have the drums here that are sent into the bed. And I have the plugs that are sent into objects 11 and 12. Now that by itself is not particularly interesting because all we are currently doing is we're sending left and right channel into left and right channel of the Dolby Atmos renderer. So that's not really interesting. The interesting thing is to move these things around in three-dimensional space and play with the positioning of those objects and the bed channels. Now for that we are going to utilize the object panner, and the panning function in Pro Tools is actually fairly sophisticated, but as I find a little bit hidden. You know, kind of most of the other DAWs have that a little bit more obvious. In Pro Tools, what you need to do is you need to click on this little thingy here, and that will bring up the panner. Here we can do a couple of different things. In order to demonstrate what we can do, let me maybe start the sound again. So what we have here in the Dolby Atmos render, we see the two objects, left and right. Now we can move them in three-dimensional space, so we can move them closer. We can move them back. We can change the height. We can also select how much percentage or how much of the signal we want in the center channel. That's actually something that I've not seen in other panners. Now, another thing which is really unusual is that we can change different kind of positions for the front and the rear. So if we click on this little kind of icon here, we can essentially kind of change the rear position. And what that means that if I'm now moving the object from the front to the back, it will actually kind of change the position, the horizontal position accordingly. So if I move that, you essentially see how that essentially moves from the front position to the back position. And that kind of, the nice thing about that is that it allows you to do automations very nicely. Another thing that you can do is you can change the height according to particular parameters. So if you want to kind of change the height manually, oopsie, here we have the height. What we can do is we can select here these different height modes. Currently it's in freeform, meaning that I'm essentially changing the height with the kind of dial here. But what I can do is I can do, for example, select wedge mode, and what that will do is, as I'm moving the object to the front, it will actually kind of change the height accordingly, according to a wedge shape. So it's going up and it's going down. And I can do the same thing with a, how do they call that? That's a sphere. So essentially kind of that would change the height according to a sphere. And we have the option here, that's the ceiling. So essentially kind of sends it back to the ceiling. So we have different options here. I usually prefer the freeform mode, but that's fine. We can also snap, so if we select that, then the objects will snap into speaker positions, which is sometimes important. Another thing that's really unusual in Pro Tools is that we can select zones. So if you want, for example, the audio to play everywhere, but not in the speakers at the back, we can actually change different zones. So for example, here, I would essentially only have the signal in the front two speakers. And that's actually fairly interesting. So I honestly haven't seen that anywhere else. So that's a really cool feature. Then we have the traditional things like size. So we can do that. So we can increase the size of these objects, and we see in the Dolby Atmos renderer that the size is played accordingly. Then Pro Tools also has this divergence option. That's actually an interesting one. My understanding is that's also unique to Pro Tools. One of the things, my understanding is that this smears the audio into the neighboring speakers in order to give you a little bit more of a kind of, it has a similar kind of effect as the size option. So what you can do is you can kind of change the divergence in the front field or kind of in the rear front back. That's also quite nice. And that's pretty much everything there is to it. Now so let me just kind of move that back a little so that we have a little bit going on here. And let's maybe link that back together, so something like that. Now, if you go into the panning, into the panner for the bed, we can do essentially exactly the same thing. Now, here you have the additional option of also being in control of the LFE. So if you want to put some signal into the LFE channel here is channel number 4, right? So no LFE. I can change how much LFE I want. And obviously, if I'm now changing the position of those, I will start to get the additional audio in the additional kind of channels here. So let's send that back a little, maybe up a little, and change the size so that we have essentially signal in all 10 channels. So the panner in Pro Tools is actually extremely powerful, and I wish I would have a similar panner in other digital audio workstations as well, because that is actually really, really nice. Now, one final thing about the panner is that you can also change how everything is visualized. So currently we are in what's called the theater mode, but you have this option here to change the panner into different types of representations. So depending on what you prefer, you can use different visualizations. I personally always work with theater mode. I like the way kind of it looks and how it gives me some impression on where exactly everything is in three-dimensional space. Now, this is really everything that we need to do in order to get our Dolby Atmos session going. So let's just have a look at exporting. So now you're done essentially. We have a very simple project here with 2 loops, and we want to export that. So how do we do that? Now, this is really straightforward to do. All we really need to do is the traditional bounce mix, and in the bounce mix we now have a couple of options. We can create re-renders. I don't have any re-renders set up, so you can configure additional renders if you want. So if you want to have a particular kind of speaker layout rendered out, you can do that here. I'm just going to create the master file, and because I don't really have any re-renders kind of set, it's not going to do anything here. And that's really everything there is to it. So let's just bounce that thing, and that should create our Dolby Atmos master file. And this Dolby Atmos master file is obviously here under bounced files, test plus WAV. So what I want to do now is I want to check if that master file is actually a valid master file. And for that, I'm going to start up the external Dolby Atmos renderer, not for actually using it in this particular workflow. I'm just going to use it in order to load in that master file to see if it actually plays correctly. So let's open up the Dolby Atmos renderer. Here we have the renderer. And let's open up the master file, open master file, and I'm going to open up this under test, bounced files, here this test file, open that up. And let's see if it actually plays correctly. And it does. So everything works exactly the way it's supposed to work. I've currently set that to monitoring 7.1.4. I'm actually only on a stereo system here. And everything works exactly the way it's supposed to work. Now, Pro Tools has a couple of features that I find particularly interesting that I have not seen in any other digital audio workstation. And one of those is or are so-called track presets. And these track presets allow you to use channel configurations more than stereo. So if you have, for example, something in 7.1.4 and you want to bring that into a Dolby Atmos session, you can do that with a track preset. And what it will do is it will take the 7.1.4 and turn that into individual objects. So you're going to have a total of 12 objects then and send that into the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this is actually relatively straightforward. So let me just close the Dolby Atmos renderer here and let's go back to our Pro Tools session. So what we need to do is, in order to get access to that, is we need to first add a new track. And the track that we're going to add is going to be a track preset, and we're going to use a Dolby Atmos preset. And let's maybe, I don't know, let's do maybe a 7.1.4. Now we have two options here. We can either use a 7.1.4 that would send that into the Dolby Atmos bed, or we can do a kind of an object-based, kind of 7.1.4. So let's do 7.1.4 objects. Let's press create, and this will essentially create everything. And all I really need to do in order to kind of send that correctly into the Dolby Atmos renderer is I need to forward any track that I want to have in 7.1.4 into this particular track that I've just created. Now, there's one kind of complication here that you might have noticed, and that is that the track preset comes with defined object numbers. So because we already kind of used objects 11 and 12, we see here that these are not activated right now because they're essentially, Pro Tools understands that these objects 11 and 12 are already used. So in order to kind of make that work, what we need to do is we need to change the objects of the already existing tracks. So what I'm going to do here is, and the last one is, I think, object 21. So anything after 21 is fine. So I'm going to simply set that to 23 to 24. And then I can activate these two additional objects here, and I have everything in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to route the drums that I have right now. They are currently routed into the bed. I'm going to route that into the track, the 7.1.4 track. And that will then make sure that these drums are no longer routed into the bed, but they're actually routed into the 7.1.4 track, which is then routed into 12 objects in the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's play that. And if we open up the Dolby Atmos renderer, we now see essentially all the individual objects. I still have the LFE signal here, so that kind of, it remembered that. But everything else is sent into individual objects. And I have 23 and 24, that was the original kind of plugs, and everything else, the drums are sent into channels 11 or objects 11 to 21. And that's actually really neat because that allows you to work with kind of surround sound that has higher channel configurations and is not limited to stereo, because especially if you're working with Pro Tools, there's a certain likelihood that you have sessions that have higher channel counts that you want to turn into Dolby Atmos, and these track presets allow you to do that very, very easily. Pro Tools has one additional feature that I find particularly interesting, and that is the ability to use live re-renders. And live re-renders essentially means that the Dolby Atmos renderer is rendering out additional speaker layouts, and you can use them within your session. So for example, if you want to do loudness measurements are usually done based on a 5.1 re-render. You can create a 5.1 re-render and then do those loudness measurements. Or if you want to do head tracking with something like EPL Virtuoso, a binaural renderer that has capabilities of head tracking, or for example the Audio Movers binaural renderer that allows you to do the rendering according to the Apple Music specifications and do head tracking with the AirPods Pro. You can do that by using live re-renders, and these live re-renders are relatively simply to set up. All we really need to do is we need to add a track here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a track, and going to do that an aux track. And let's do maybe a 5.1. And we are going to create that. And then all we really need to do is in the input section, we can select here re-renders and then select loudness 5.1. And that will essentially create these re-renders. And then we can put a loudness measurement plugin on the track and kind of measure the loudness that way, or can do whatever we want. So this is really convenient. You can create additional re-renders. So if the 5.1 is in there by default, because that's the one that you usually use for loudness measurements, but you can create additional channel configurations for those re-renders and do it that way. And that's actually really, really convenient. Now, there's one additional thing that I wanted to demonstrate, and that is that Pro Tools also allows you to load in master files and start your Dolby Atmos session that way. And for that purpose, let me first create a new session, and I'm going to call that test 2. Test 2. I'm going to once again do like a stereo mix. I'm going to create that, and then let's save that. And then essentially what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to take the master file that I've just created. So here we have the master file, and I'm going to drop that into my session. And what that will probably bring up is an input dialog, and I can then essentially select what I want to do with these tracks that is sort of are in the master file. Now, in my particular case, I don't really have anything yet, so what I'm going to do is I'm simply say this all going to be new tracks, and I'm going to press OK, and this will then open up that master file, and everything is set up correctly. So if I now play that audio, and I can once again open up the renderer, and I have everything in exactly the same way as I had before. And this works actually really, really, really well. So you can also load in master files, which is one of the big features of Pro Tools. There aren't really that many digital audio workstations that can do that. Noendo can do that. DaVinci Resolve Fairlight can do that. But other than that, that's pretty much it. So this is a really cool feature that Pro Tools has. And that's all I wanted to cover today. As said previously, next week I'll explain how to use the external renderer in Pro Tools. So if you're interested in the topic, don't forget to press the subscribe button. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below or join us on our Discord server for a chat. You'll find an invite link in the description below. And with that being said, see you all in the next video.